Before I introduce our next speaker, I kind of want to sort of frame the discussion where we are. So we've sort of talked about a number of topics. We talked about code creation. We talked about how hospitals are paid and how that relates to code creation, but also how that relates to code valuation and payment, the RUC, if you will. Then we ventured into what Ray talked about, which is sort of a broader policy as far as how Medicaid itself is managed. And what we're going to do next is talk about a really important part of the process, and that's coverage. There's sort of a saying in the Medicare or sort of the payment revenue cycle world, and that is a code does not necessarily equal payment, but positive coverage does equal payment, which allows me to introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Bob Zeman. So Bob is a professor and chairman of radiology and radiation oncology, again here in DC at the George Washington University Medical Center. Since 2008, Bob has been chair of the ACR's Carrier Advisory Committee. He has also served as a voting member of the CMS Evidence Development and Carrier Advisory Committee. He is nothing short of an expert on this topic, and he will share this expertise with you here shortly. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Robert Zeman. Thanks, Bob. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Zeke. Well, it's ironic that I'm sort of losing my voice, actually, from laryngitis, because, in fact, my talk is very much about us maintaining our voice through the Carrier Advisory Committee network, which is really a very important part of the coverage process. I have no relevant financial disclosures. As many of you know, when CMS decides to consider extending coverage as a reasonable and necessary benefit to Medicare beneficiaries, it can either go one of two pathways. It can either generate a national coverage determination policy or generate and defer to the Medicare contractors a local coverage determination policy. In the case of the latter, the Carrier Advisory Committee network can have significant input into the development of that LCD or local coverage determination policy. And this is important because most advanced imaging is covered under LCDs. So CT and MRI usually fall under local policy. I also, like Dr. Tu, want to give a shout out to Alicia Blakey, who's also our staff economist, who does an amazing job and does a lot of the heavy lifting on the issues for the CAC network, as well as Gloria Bland, who posts a lot of the draft policies as well as some of the discussions on the Engage website. And this has been a really useful tool for sharing information. Now, as Zeke mentioned, I've chaired the CAC Network Committee for quite a while, and the map on 2007 had a lot more colors on it. There were many more jurisdictions. It really felt like the policies were really local. Currently, though, there's only 12 jurisdictions and only 7 MACs, or insurance companies, in those jurisdictions that are responsible for the policies. And unfortunately, when you have those few number of jurisdictions, local policies almost feel like de facto national policies. So we have to be more vigilant than ever to make sure that our voices are heard and maintained in these important discussions. So I'm going to talk about 2 areas: the LCD process modernization, which is going on right now, as well as some of the Medicare coverage challenges and successes in the last few years. Really, the LCD process used to be sort of like my daughter's new puppy. It was kind of warm and fuzzy. There would be a little bit of evidence presented at the meetings. We'd have breakfast. Some of the internists would talk about specific anecdotes about their patients, and that's sort of how we would come to consensus. But that sort of changed, at least is going through this evolution now as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed by President Obama in 2016. I think a lot of us felt that, in fact, most of the act related to expediting drug and technology approval through the FDA and about IT interoperability. But the legislation also included a section there on improving Medicare local coverage determinations. And so that is what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes. The new process is really very much all about evidence. It's sort of almost creating a mini MedCAC as the local CACs and under the jurisdictions of the MACs creates these policies. And So as this process is evolving now, the MACs will create an environment where we call together a meeting and they review formal coverage requests and convene the meetings to discuss the evidence in the literature. So we no longer will be discussing draft LCDs. We'll actually be reviewing the literature first. And those meetings may be single or multi-jurisdictional. They're open to the public and will be recorded. And only the CAC members and subject matter experts or SMEs may discuss the evidence and be part of the voting process. Now, again, we still don't have a draft LCD. Once all that has taken place, then the MAC will create the draft LCD. They'll post it and circulate it for 45 days for comment. The public can, again, weigh in on this, and we can offer written comments before it's finalized. And so we just recently had one of these multi-jurisdictional meetings regarding percutaneous vertebral augmentation. And this was fairly well orchestrated insofar as that the evidence was sent out in advance. There were a number of thought leaders on the call. Doug Beal, who was involved in the EVOLVE trial, as a picture there, was very active in terms of the dialogue. The call was actually co-moderated by Josh Hirsch from Mass General, who's also an expert in this field. So there were a lot of very important voices on the call. There was a very detailed discussion. And then the voting questions, which were circulated in advance, we were allowed to sort of think over those answers and assess how confident we were in particular outcomes, what impact vertebroplasty had on the patient's life, and how effective the procedures were. And so I thought it was a very thoughtful, very positive process. We don't know the results of that discussion yet. We haven't seen the draft LCD yet that will come out. But again, I think that sort of illustrates how the process certainly can work. And I think people felt their voices were heard. But it does take a village. I mean, I think that the new process in the sort of the non-multi-jurisdictional way, when it involves individual jurisdictions, is going to take more commitment from the individual CACs. And it's important to know that the ACR really is standing behind us and ready to provide resources for gathering evidence, for integration with the subject matter experts and other specialties. And so I think that, I'm fairly optimistic that together we will be able to make very positive impact on adjusting to this new process. Minor edits to LCDs will not have to go through this process, so that's sort of very good news. And also, Level 3 codes may now also be considered again. Again, for a while, they were considered only experimental and wouldn't come before typically the MACs for development of LCDs. But again, through separate policy, CMS has said they want to foster innovation, and therefore we will be able to consider these again in the future. And that process has already started. With an example of it would be using focused ultrasound to treat essential tremors. That's a Level 3 code, and yet many of the MACs are moving forward with LCDs on that. I want to end by just talking about some of the other Medicare coverage issues and both challenges and opportunities. I think lung cancer screening has certainly been successful from a coverage standpoint. We may not be screening as many people as we think we should, but nevertheless, at least from the coverage standpoint, it's been successful and a very positive screening benefit. There are some issues that are still unresolved in the IDTF setting, and the USPSTF is embarking now on a 5-year review, actually, of lung cancer screening. It's important to know that, we don't know what the outcome of that will be yet, but they may actually potentially expand the pool of patients to be screened, such as including the NCCN Category 2 patients. So we'll wait and see what happens. There's been a lot of progress made in getting new radiopharmaceuticals approved, particularly for PET-CT, such as gallium-68 dotatate and lutetium dotatate, sort of part of this move towards personalized molecular imaging that allows us to image patients and then treat them if they have the appropriate receptors that are being imaged. I think we'll see more of that in the area of prostate molecular imaging also. I think last year, many of you know that non-MR compatible pacemakers now have the coverage ban has been lifted on those. But again, just like for MR compatible pacemakers, there's going to be quite a bit of education involved before it really becomes mainstream. But again, there is a safety record through registry data and other sources of data suggesting that even the non-MR compatible devices can be imaged under specific circumstances. I wish I had more positive news about CT colonography. It's really still on hold, and CMS has again raised issues about the applicability to the Medicare population. They've raised issues about extracolonic findings, even though the USPSTF gave colon cancer screening overall an A rating. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. They are reevaluating the USPSTF as CT colonography again, and so we'll see what happens with that. But I know Dr. Judy Yee and the whole colon cancer committee have been working tirelessly to try and move that technology through to Medicare coverage. And as you know, H.R. 1969 is picking up some support, but needs some additional support in order to move forward, where legislation would potentially push CMS to providing the same kind of coverage that a lot of the commercial payers have in place. And then finally, we are involved in a lot of other technical issues. There's been a fair number of communications from CMS about, for example, the date of service that's supposed to be used on professional claims, and we've been working very closely with the RBMA in that area. So I think more to follow. So I want to make sure that everybody realizes, and again under Zeke's leadership, how the ACR Economics Commission, its volunteers and staff are really engaged on your behalf. I mean, us as you, basically. And I really think it's important for me particularly, and on behalf of all of us, to thank our CAC representatives because they really do a lot of the heavy lifting on this, and also the chapters who support those CAC representatives. So thank you very much.